The movie opens with Peter Parker chasing after a field trip bus apparently for a long time before this girl named Mary Jane tells the driver to just let him on. Once he's on, not a single soul wants to sit next to him, not even the nerdy girl. They arrive at the destination, which is some sort of biology museum, and this cool guy named Harry catches up to Peter and introduces his father, Norman Osborn, who is something of a scientist. By some sheer stroke of luck, the first thing we see is a spider exhibit, where a lady goes over every single power a spider has just so we know exactly which powers a spider-based superhero would get. Peter tells Harry one of these cool facts, and he takes it and tells Mary Jane like it's his own original thought, which is a dick move. Peter very creepily asks Mary Jane if he can take her photo and backs up exactly right below this genetically modified and weaponized super spider, which bites him and then runs away. Cut to Norman at Oscorp, who is showing off a new technology to the military, which includes a bladed glider and a super soldier serum, which another scientist mentions has side effects of insanity and violent tendencies. Despite the warnings, this general guy gives the demand that a successful human trial needs to happen or they're pulling funding. Peter comes home to his aunt and uncle and says he feels like shit and is gonna call it a night at 4:30 p.m. His uncle Ben asks him about photos and he blows the question off, which triggers every known parental alarm. Peter, who by the way knows he got bit by a fucked up spider, is absolutely going through it in his bedroom. Instead of going to the hospital like a reasonable person would, he passes out on the floor. Back at Oscorp, Norman makes the call to go through with human trials, and to not risk any unnecessary lives, he makes himself the test subject. Then he dies. Only for a second though. Peter wakes up and now realizes he has 20/20 vision without his glasses, producing a meme format that would live for decades. He's also fucking ripped. Harry goes to check on his dad, who is taking the second floor nap of the film. Some lady busts in and tells Norman that his assistant is dead and their glider got jacked, to which he genuinely seems to have no recollection of. During lunch at school, Mary Jane says something vaguely nice to Peter and he shuts down, entirely incapable of speech. Then he shoots some webs out of his wrist and flings food at the cool jock bully. The bully tries to box Peter, but Peter sees shit in slow-mo, so that doesn't go well for him. When Peter finally swings back, the bully flies back like 30 feet and nobody thinks it's strange at all. Peter runs away and then sees a spider, somehow putting it together that he is now a spider. Then he climbs a building and jumps across some roofs and figures out how to shoot webs all in rapid succession. To cap it all off, his first instinct when he completes a solid web string is to swing off it, which isn't a characteristic of spiders I'm aware of, but it works anyway. Later that night, while taking out the trash, Peter hears MJ's parents screaming at each other about literally the most generic shit possible, and then she meets him outside where they discuss their dreams about photography and acting respectively. Mary Jane then goes off with her boyfriend and compliments his nice new car. After watching that transpire, Peter naturally decides that all he needs to win Mary Jane over is a nice new car of his own. He finds one just shy of $3,000, and conveniently right below it there's an ad for a wrestling event for exactly $3,000. He draws up a bunch of doodles coming up with his wrestling persona, and that's the origin of the suit in this timeline. Peter lies about needing to go to the library, and Uncle Ben drives him there, and when they arrive, Ben gives the famous great power, great responsibility speech. Peter does not take it well and gives a very cliched "you're not my dad" before leaving and slamming the door. Pete arrives at the event, which is no fake WWE shit, this is the real deal, but it's fine because he's superhuman. For some reason, Peter gets to have a cage match when every prior match was just a normal ring, but due to his unique abilities, this gives him a great place to camp. Of course, Spider-Man is announced as the new champion, but the sleazeball owner only gives him $100. Karma strikes instantly as a robber walks in just as Peter leaves. This robber then runs towards the elevator, and Peter lets him go as some sort of recompense for not getting his full payment. As a reminder, this is the money he intended to use to buy a car to impress a girl. Heading back to the library to get picked up, Uncle Ben has been shot by a carjacker. He dies at the scene, holding Peter's hand. Overhearing the police say where the shooter is headed, he decides to take justice into his own hands as Spider-Man, which is mostly CGI. Peter catches the shooter, and it was the armed criminal he let go because he was upset about the car money. Whoops, shouldn't have done that shit, eh, Pete? Then the robber falls out a window and dies. The military general from earlier goes to check on Norman Osborn's rival company for a replacement. The test is interrupted by a sudden barrage of explosions from a suspiciously familiar glider. At the high school graduation, Norman gives Peter a chat about always being there for him, while MJ and Flash Thompson break up. Peter laments over his last words to Uncle Ben, and Aunt May tries to give him a pep talk about how it's fine and Ben knew he was destined for greatness. Peter interprets this as a go-ahead to go full vigilante mode and use his powers to help civilians. Then there's a whole montage of said vigilante justice. The higher-ups at this news place discuss whether Spider-Man is good or bad, but the conversation ends with both sides agreeing that he is profitable. Thus they decide to advertise cash for Spider-Man pics. At some random burger joint, Peter meets up with MJ and they catch up, which includes MJ dropping the dagger that she is in a relationship with Harry. This upsets Peter, but he decides not to confront Harry about it. Peter does some more Spider-Manning, but this time takes pictures of himself to sell to the Daily Bugle. At a business meeting, Norman celebrates his company surpassing the one that exploded earlier. The rest of the board then explain that other company is buying Oscorp out, and Norman needs to resign, which makes no sense to me because their stock price is lower, but it probably makes sense. Then there's some big party for the Oscorp buyout, I think, and a masked villain shows up on a glider and throws some bombs that either explode like normal bombs or turn people into CGI skeletons, depending on the setting. The unnamed villain and Spider-Man throw hands for a while, and then the villain gets bored and leaves. Due to the prior explosions, Mary Jane is now plummeting off the side of a building. Peter, of course, rushes to save her immediately and swings off with her, turning himself into a mannequin on a green screen, but only for a moment. Spider-Man leaves MJ on top of a building and dodges revealing his identity by swinging away. MJ retells the story to Harry, and Harry is naturally very jealous of the guy with real superpowers. Then the boys discuss the backstabbing, but Peter lets it slide because he is a good friend. At his mansion, Norman has a schizophrenic episode where the voice of the villain taunts him. Turns out the experiment from the start of the movie gave him a split personality with murderous tendencies and a cool new voice. Peter's new boss shows him the news headline, which names the villain the Green Goblin, who then appears and asks who's been taking these pictures of Spider-Man. Peter pulls a Houdini, disappearing from behind Jameson and out the window to rescue him, but then Goblin hits him with some snooze gas. Goblin and Spider-Man have a conversation about using their powers selflessly or selfishly, and Goblin offers an accord and flies off before Spider-Man can give his answer, leading us to wonder what path will he choose. Mary Jane is exiting an audition, and Pete is non-creepily there and asks how it went. Turns out she bombed because she isn't good at acting, but she keeps trying anyway. Then he accidentally shows romantic interest in her, and she doesn't shut it down, which is a W in anyone's book. After the conversation, Mary Jane leaves, and some convenient vague criminals chase after her and make weird animal noises at her, just in time for Spider-Man to swing in to rescue her. She then thanks him with a kiss, which has been replicated 1 billion times by nerds worldwide. The next day, I'm not sure, an apartment complex is on fire, and Spider-Man comes to help with his famous fire extinguishing powers. No, I'm kidding. He goes to save a baby that's still trapped inside, which he does effortlessly. Afterwards, the civilian points out that someone is still stuck in the building, and Spider-Man rushes in towards a woman's crying. But it was actually just Green Goblin in a Big Bad Wolf cosplay. Spider-Man says no to Goblin's offer, and then they fight, and Spider-Man does a Matrix thing, more than once actually, but there is no winner, and then they both go to Thanksgiving dinner with the 3 other named characters. Pete arrives late, and everyone thinks they hear him upstairs, but he's still in Spider-Man drip, so he hides on the ceiling. Unfortunately for him, that son of a bitch Goblin nicked him in their battle, and a drop of blood hits the ground, allowing Norman to get a little sus. This wasn't a cliche in 2002, don't worry about it. At dinner, Norman gets to see Peter's cut live and puts everything together, then he leaves. Harry follows after him, and they have a very loud argument about how MJ is trashed just outside the door. Harry sticks up for his dad, and MJ leaves crying. The Green Goblin's first move after learning Spider-Man's identity, logically, is to attack Aunt May. Mostly psychological, it seems, because she's still conscious, but she screams about yellow eyes, and Peter realizes it was because his cover has been blown. In the waiting room, Mary Jane admits that she's crushing on Spider-Man to Spider-Man, and Spider-Man tries his best not to explode with joy. Instead, he gives some other big speech about how he's basically in love with Mary Jane, which must be very confusing to her because she hasn't figured out the identity yet despite all the clues he's thrown at her. MJ presumably dumps Harry for Peter because Harry and Norman have a conversation about how Norman was right, and then Norman says some ominous shit about rectifying something or other. Goblin's next master plan is to kidnap Mary Jane and put her up really high where Spider-Man hopefully can't get her. He does get to her, so Goblin goes to plan B, which is make him pick between her or a cable car full of children. Spider-Man saves both, obviously, but he prioritized the girl, just in case you were wondering. Spider-Man dangles from the bridge holding onto the cable car, waiting for a platform to be driven under it, and Goblin takes free hits on him. Then civilians throw random garbage at him, which is apparently enough of a distraction to buy enough time. The Green Goblin then kidnaps Spider-Man and takes him off to a private fighting location. Peter gets exploded a little bit, and then they have some philosophical discussion and box for a while. Just when Spider-Man is winning, Norman reveals his identity to Peter, surprisingly looking more like a goblin with his mask off. Afterwards, Norman tries to pull the split personality it wasn't me and sneak attack Peter with his glider, but Pete backflips out of the way and Norman kills himself, Frieza style. His last request is that Harry isn't told the truth. Spider-Man drops the body off, and Harry just happens to unfortunately be in the room at that exact second. He reaches for his piece, but Spider-Man's already gone. At the funeral, Harry naturally assumes that Spider-Man, who is in all the headlines as a villain, killed his father for no reason. Over at Uncle Ben's grave, MJ says that when she was gonna die, she realized she didn't love Spider-Man anymore. She loved Peter, because she still doesn't know. They share a kiss, but Peter is going through a really shit headspace where he wants to distance himself from everyone so they don't get hurt, and he says he just wants to be friends. Ice cold, Peter. Mary Jane sobs for the 17th time this film, and then has an epiphany that her lips feel the same now as they did when she kissed Spider-Man, which doesn't make any goddamn sense. Peter then walks off and has an internal monologue about how he's cursed to never be close to anyone. Cut directly to him doing some sick flips around New York as Spider-Man.